The sun beat down mercilessly on Ruby Foster's raw wrists as blood trickled down the wooden post where she'd been shackled for nearly 2 days. Her crime nothing more than speaking her mind in a town that demanded women remain silent. The year was 1876, and Bitter Creek, Arizona Territory, was as unforgiving as its name suggested. At 22, Ruby had learned that a woman's place was supposedly in the home, silent and obedient, but she had never been one to accept such limitations. When Sheriff Harmon had attempted to seize the small parcel of land she'd inherited from her father, claiming a woman couldn't possibly manage property, she'd stood her ground at the town meeting. "You have no right," she had shouted, rising to her feet in the crowded hall while the men muttered their disapproval. "That land was legally deeded to me, and I'll work it until my dying day." Her outburst had cost her dearly. Sheriff Harmon, red-faced and furious, had dragged her to the post in the center of town, declaring her in contempt of proper order. "3 days without water ought to teach you some manners," he'd spat, locking the heavy iron shackles around her wrists as the townspeople looked on, some with pity, most with righteous satisfaction. Now, as the afternoon sun blazed overhead, Ruby's lips were cracked and bleeding, her throat so parched she could barely swallow. Her once clean blue dress was stained with dust and sweat, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves around her face. She'd lost track of time, drifting in and out of consciousness as dehydration took its toll. Through the haze of her suffering, Ruby heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the harsh light. A lone rider approached from the east, his silhouette wavering in the heat. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall man atop a powerful chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders outlined against the cloudless sky. Lucas Dawson had been riding for 3 days straight, making his way from Colorado to California with nothing but his horse, Winchester, and the clothes on his back. At 26, he'd spent the last 8 years working cattle drives, mining claims, and taking whatever honest work he could find. The war had left him restless, unable to settle in one place for long, haunted by memories he couldn't shake. He slowed his horse as he approached the small town, needing supplies before continuing west. The sight that greeted him as he rode down the main street stopped him cold. A woman, barely conscious, chained to a post in the center of town, her head hanging limply. Lucas dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. He approached cautiously, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. The woman lifted her head slightly as his shadow fell across her, revealing a face streaked with dirt and tears but still defiant. "Water," she whispered, her voice a painful rasp. Without hesitation, Lucas uncorked his canteen and held it to her parched lips. She drank greedily, coughing as the cool liquid hit her throat. "Easy now," he murmured, supporting her head. "Not too fast." After she'd had her fill, Lucas examined the shackles binding her to the post. "What's your crime, miss?" he asked quietly. Ruby met his gaze, her green eyes fierce despite her weakened state. "I spoke up against injustice," she replied. "And I'm a woman. That's crime enough in Bitter Creek." Lucas's jaw tightened. He'd seen plenty of frontier justice in his travels, but this struck him as particularly cruel. "How long have you been here?" 2 days, I think." She swallowed painfully. "Sheriff said 3 days would teach me my place." Lucas stood, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip as he scanned the street. The town seemed oddly quiet, with only a few figures hurrying past, deliberately avoiding looking their way. "What's your name?" he asked, turning back to her. "Ruby Foster," she answered. "And I'd shake your hand, but—" She gave a weak laugh, rattling the chains. Despite the situation, Lucas found himself smiling. "Lucas Dawson," he replied. "And I think we can do something about those shackles." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a set of tools. As a cowboy who'd spent years on the trail, he'd learned that lock-picking was a valuable skill. Kneeling beside her, he worked the lock with practiced hands. "The sheriff won't like this," Ruby warned, though hope had begun to flicker in her eyes. Lucas continued working the lock. "I reckon I don't much care what the sheriff likes." The first shackle clicked open, and Ruby gasped as blood rushed back into her hand. Lucas moved to the second one, working quickly now. "Where will you go?" he asked as the second lock yielded. Ruby rubbed her raw wrists, wincing. I have a small homestead about 3 miles outside town. My father left it to me when he died last year. That's what started all this trouble. Lucas helped her to her feet, but her legs buckled immediately. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms and carried her to his horse. What are you doing? She protested weakly. Getting you out of here before the sheriff returns, Lucas replied, lifting her onto his saddle before mounting behind her. You can direct me to your place. They'd barely reached the edge of town when shouts erupted behind them. Lucas glanced back to see a portly man in a sheriff's badge running into the street, waving his arms frantically. That's him, Ruby confirmed. Sheriff Harmon. Lucas spurred his horse into a gallop, one arm secure around Ruby's waist as they fled the town. The sheriff's angry shouts faded behind them as the chestnut stallion ate up the distance, dust billowing in their wake. Ruby leaned back against Lucas's chest, too weak to sit upright on her own. Despite her situation, she felt an unexpected sense of security in this stranger's arms. His body was solid and warm against her back, his breathing steady in her ear. East, she instructed weakly, pointing toward a cluster of low hills. Follow the creek bed. They rode in silence for some time, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling Ruby into a state of semi-consciousness. When they finally arrived at a small, weathered cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping, Lucas gently shook her awake. Is this it? He asked. Ruby nodded, taking in the sight of her humble home with relief. The small vegetable garden she'd planted was wilted from lack of attention, but the cabin itself appeared undisturbed. Lucas dismounted first, then carefully lifted Ruby down. This time, she was able to stand, though she leaned heavily against him as they made their way to the door. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean, with a small stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Lucas helped Ruby to sit on the edge of the bed, then busied himself lighting the stove and searching for food. There's jerky in the jar by the window, Ruby told him, and some dried beans in the sack underneath the table. While Lucas prepared a simple meal, Ruby gathered her strength. The horror of the past 2 days began to recede as she watched this stranger move about her kitchen with quiet efficiency. Why did you help me? She asked finally. You could have ridden on by. Lucas paused, a thoughtful expression crossing his weathered face. I've seen too much suffering to add to it by doing nothing, he answered simply. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not for speaking their mind. He brought her a tin cup of water and a plate of the jerky. Eat slowly, he advised. Your stomach needs to adjust. As Ruby ate, Lucas tended to his horse outside, unsaddling the chestnut and giving him water from the small creek that ran behind the cabin. When he returned, he carried his bedroll and saddlebags. I'll sleep outside tonight, he said, setting his things near the door. If the sheriff comes looking, I want to be ready. Ruby shook her head. There's room enough in here, she insisted. You can take the floor if you're worried about propriety, but I won't have my rescuer sleeping in the dirt. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. Much obliged. As night fell, they talked by the light of a single oil lamp. Ruby told him about her father, a hard-working miner who had finally staked a claim to this small piece of land after years of wandering. She explained how she'd learned to work the land alongside him, and how after his death, the men of Bitter Creek had expected her to sell the property and either marry or move on. But this is my home, she said fiercely. The only real home I've ever known. I won't give it up just because I'm a woman alone. Lucas nodded, understanding in his deep blue eyes. A person's got a right to fight for what's theirs, he agreed. He told her some of his own story, orphan young, raised by an uncle who taught him ranching before the war came and changed everything. I've been drifting since '68, he admitted. Never found a place that felt worth staying. As they talked, Ruby became increasingly aware of Lucas as a man, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his worn shirt, the strength in his hands as he gestured, the way the lamplight caught in his light brown hair. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior, and she found herself drawn to his quiet confidence. For his part, Lucas couldn't help but admire Ruby's spirit. Despite her ordeal, she spoke with passion about her land and her right to it. Her auburn hair had begun to dry from her hasty washing, forming soft waves around a face that, even tired and marked by suffering, held a striking beauty. When exhaustion finally overtook her, Ruby reluctantly prepared for bed. Lucas spread his bedroll on the floor beside the door, his pistol within easy reach. As Ruby settled beneath her quilt, she watched him through half-closed eyes. "Thank you, Lucas Dawson," she murmured sleepily. "I won't forget today." Lucas smiled in the darkness. "Get some rest, Miss Foster. Tomorrow will be soon enough to worry about what comes next." But the next day brought trouble sooner than either expected. Ruby woke to the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders by the sound of it. Lucas was already on his feet, peering through the window with his Winchester in hand. "Sheriff's brought company," he reported grimly. "4 men, all armed." Ruby scrambled from bed, her heart pounding. She grabbed her father's old shotgun from beside the fireplace, checking that it was loaded. "Miss Foster," Sheriff Harmon's voice boomed outside. "Come on out now. You're in serious trouble, girl, and so's that stranger who helped you." Lucas and Ruby exchanged looks. "Stay inside," he told her. "Let me handle this." "It's my fight," she protested. "It's our fight now," he corrected her, his eyes holding hers for a moment before he moved to the door. Lucas stepped outside, rifle held casually but ready. Sheriff Harmon sat atop a dappled gray horse, flanked by 3 hard-looking men. All had their hands near their weapons. "Morning, Sheriff," Lucas greeted calmly. "Something I can help you with?" Harmon's face flushed with anger. "You can help by handing over that troublemaking woman and coming peacefully. Interfering with justice is a serious offense, stranger." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, seemingly relaxed, though every muscle was tensed for action. "Seems to me that chaining a woman to a post in the hot sun isn't justice at all. Looks more like cruelty." "That's not for you to decide," Harmon snapped. "The law in Bitter Creek is what I say it is." "That's where you're wrong, Sheriff." The new voice came from behind the group of riders. Everyone turned to see a man in a dusty black coat dismounting from a bay gelding. He wore a silver star on his vest, a U.S. Marshal's badge. "Marshal Jenkins," the man introduced himself, approaching the group. "I've been tracking reports of abuse of power in this county. Seems I arrived just in time." Sheriff Harmon's face paled. "Now see here, Marshal, I was just maintaining order by torturing a woman for speaking at a town meeting." Jenkins cut him off. "I've already spoken to several witnesses in town. Your days as sheriff are over, Harmon." The sheriff's hand moved toward his gun, but Jenkins was faster. "I wouldn't," he warned, his own weapon already drawn. "Now, all of you dismount and drop your weapons." Slowly. The standoff was tense, but faced with a federal marshal, Harmon and his men eventually complied. As Jenkins secured them, Ruby emerged from the cabin, shotgun still in hand. "Miss Foster," Jenkins acknowledged her with a nod. "I'll need your statement about what happened." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as Jenkins took statements and prepared to transport his prisoners back to town. Before leaving, he turned to Ruby and Lucas. "The county judge will be through in 2 weeks," he explained. "Until then, Miss Foster, your property rights are secure. No one will trouble you." After the marshal left with his prisoners, Ruby and Lucas stood in the yard, the sudden quiet almost disorienting after the morning's events. "Well," Lucas said finally, "I suppose I should be moving on." Ruby looked at him sharply. "Where will you go?" He shrugged. "California, I guess." That was the plan. Ruby hesitated, then spoke with determination. "You could stay, at least until the hearing. I could use the help around here, and—" She faltered, then continued more softly. "I'd feel safer knowing you were nearby." Lucas studied her face, noting the faint blush that colored her cheeks. Something had changed between them during their brief acquaintance, a connection neither had expected, but both could feel. "I suppose California can wait a bit longer," he agreed with a smile. The 2 weeks that followed were transformative for both Ruby and Lucas. Together, they worked to repair the neglected homestead. Lucas mended the roof, which had begun to leak, and built a proper fence around Ruby's garden. Ruby showed him the small stream where her father had occasionally found gold flakes, though never enough to make them rich. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and purple. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal, as trust developed between them. Lucas spoke of the nightmares that still plagued him from the war, of comrades lost and horrors witnessed. Ruby shared her fears of losing the land, of being forced into a marriage of convenience just to survive. My father always said I was too headstrong for my own good, she confessed one evening. He worried what would become of me after he was gone. Lucas chuckled. I think your father would be proud of how you've stood your ground. Ruby glanced at him, moonlight silvering her auburn hair. What about you, Lucas? What would make you proud? He considered the question seriously. Finding a place worth fighting for, he answered finally. A purpose beyond just surviving day to day. As he spoke, his eyes met hers, and the air between them seemed to charge with unspoken possibility. Ruby's breath caught in her throat as Lucas slowly leaned toward her. Their lips met in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of newfound connection. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his hands gently cupping her face. I never expected to find you, he whispered. I've been running so long. I forgot what it was to stand still. Ruby placed her hand over his heart. Then stand still with me, Lucas. See where this leads. The day of the county hearing arrived all too quickly. Ruby dressed in her best, a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, while Lucas wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard. Together, they rode into Bitter Creek, aware of the stares and whispers that followed them through town. The hearing was held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that gathered. Judge Wilson, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, presided from behind a makeshift bench. Former Sheriff Harmon, now in custody pending trial for abuse of authority, sat with his lawyer, shooting venomous glares at Ruby. His supporters had rallied, claiming that Ruby's homestead should revert to the town since a woman couldn't properly work the land. When Ruby's turn came to speak, she stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering as she described her father's work on the land, the legal deed that named her as his heir, and her own efforts to maintain the property. I may be a woman, she concluded, but I am no less capable of working this land than any man. All I ask is the right to prove it on the property that is legally mine. Judge Wilson questioned her thoroughly, then called for any witnesses who could speak to Ruby's character and capabilities. To her surprise, several townspeople stood, including Mrs. Holloway, the shopkeeper's wife, who testified that Ruby had always paid her debts promptly and worked harder than most men she knew. Then Lucas stepped forward. Your Honor, he began, I've only known Miss Foster for 2 weeks, but in that time I've seen a woman of extraordinary courage and determination. She's survived hardship that would break most people, and she's done it with dignity and grace. He paused, then continued more personally. I was a drifter before I met Ruby Foster. I fought in the war, and afterward, I couldn't seem to find my place in this world. But watching her fight for her home reminded me what it means to believe in something worth fighting for. Judge Wilson studied Lucas thoughtfully. And what is your interest in this matter, Mr. Dawson? Are you planning to continue drifting once these proceedings conclude? Lucas turned to look at Ruby, his expression open and vulnerable. No, Your Honor. If Miss Foster will have me, I intend to stay and help her work that land. Not because she needs my help, she's proven she can manage on her own, but because I've found something I never expected to find in Bitter Creek. Ruby's eyes filled with tears as Lucas spoke. They hadn't discussed the future beyond the hearing, both perhaps afraid to hope for too much. After all testimonies were heard, Judge Wilson retired to consider his decision. The wait seemed interminable, but finally, he returned with his ruling. It is the finding of this court that the property in question legally belongs to Miss Ruby Foster by right of inheritance, he declared. Furthermore, the actions taken against Miss Foster by former Sheriff Harmon were unlawful and reprehensible. This court upholds her right to maintain and work her property as she sees fit. Relief washed over Ruby like a cool rain. As the crowd dispersed, some congratulating her while others muttered their disapproval, Lucas stood beside her, a steady presence amid the chaos. When they were finally alone outside the church, Ruby turned to him. Did you mean what you said in there? About staying? Lucas took her hands in his. Every word, he assured her. If you'll have me, that is. I'm not a wealthy man, Ruby. I can't offer you much beyond my hands and my heart. Ruby smiled through her tears. Those are the only things I need, she told him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, heedless of the scandalized gasps from passing townspeople. 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Ruby Foster became Ruby Dawson in a simple ceremony performed in front of their cabin. Marshal Jenkins returned for the occasion, bringing news that former Sheriff Harmon had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his crimes. The small homestead began to flourish under their combined efforts. Lucas's experience with livestock helped them establish a modest herd of cattle, while Ruby's garden expanded to provide not only for their needs, but enough extra to sell in town. Gradually, attitudes in Bitter Creek began to shift. Ruby's success, coupled with Lucas's respected presence, challenged old assumptions about women's capabilities. Other women began to speak more openly at town meetings, and when elections were held for a new sheriff, Lucas was surprised to find himself nominated. "I'm no lawman," he protested when Ruby encouraged him to accept. "You understand justice better than most," she countered, "and the town needs someone who will treat everyone fairly." After much consideration, Lucas accepted the position, riding into town 3 days a week to maintain order while continuing to work the homestead with Ruby. His fair-minded approach earned him respect even from those who had initially resented an outsider taking the job. A year after their wedding, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the sunset, Ruby took Lucas's hand and placed it on her slightly rounded belly. "I think our family is growing," she said softly, watching his expression transform from confusion to wonder. Lucas gathered her into his arms, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him from lonely drifter to husband, homesteader, sheriff, and now, father-to-be. "When I cut you free from that post," he murmured against her hair, "I never imagined I was also freeing myself." Ruby smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Sometimes the strongest chains are the ones we don't even realize we're wearing." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking of their plans for the future, expanding the cabin, setting aside land for their child, building a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. 5 years passed, bringing prosperity to the Dawson homestead and significant changes to Bitter Creek. Lucas continued as sheriff, earning a reputation for fairness that drew new settlers to the area. Ruby, now mother to 3-year-old Thomas and 1-year-old Elizabeth, still managed the homestead while becoming increasingly involved in town affairs. When the territorial government established a school in Bitter Creek, Ruby was asked to serve on the board that would oversee it. Her insistence that girls receive the same education as boys initially met resistance, but eventually prevailed. "Things are changing," she remarked to Lucas one evening as they watched their children play in the yard. "Slowly, perhaps, but changing nonetheless." Lucas nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "You helped start that change," he reminded her, standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Ruby leaned against him, grateful for the life they'd built together. "I was just defending what was mine," she said. "I never set out to change anything." "Sometimes the most important changes start that way," Lucas observed. One person refusing to accept injustice. As the children tired of their play and came running to their parents, Lucas scooped them up, one in each arm, their laughter ringing in the evening air. Ruby watched, her heart full to bursting, marveling at how a moment of terrible suffering had ultimately led her to such profound joy. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Ruby and Lucas lay together in the darkness, talking in hushed voices about their dreams for the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruby asked. "Stopping that day? Cutting me free?" Lucas pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Not for a single moment," he assured her. "Finding you was like finding a part of myself I never knew was missing." Ruby traced the outline of his face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I think about it sometimes how different our lives would be if you'd ridden past, or if I'd given in and sold the land. We found each other because neither of us was willing to surrender what we believed in," Lucas said. "Your courage called to something in me that had been sleeping a long time." As they drifted toward sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Ruby reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from a woman shackled to a post and a drifting cowboy with nowhere to call home, to this life they'd built together, founded on mutual respect and deepening love. Outside their window, the vast Arizona sky stretched overhead, stars scattered like promises across the darkness. On their land, in the home they'd built with their own hands, Ruby and Lucas Dawson had found not just love, but a shared purpose, creating a place where justice and compassion could flourish. where their children could grow up understanding that courage sometimes meant standing alone, and that true freedom came not just from breaking chains, but from building something worth fighting for. Their story, which had begun with an act of defiance and mercy, had become something neither could have imagined on that fateful day, a testament to the power of standing one's ground and the unexpected gifts that could come from offering a helping hand to another soul in need.